Nike is the largest sports company in the world by far. In fact, they're so dominant that they're 5 times larger than the second largest sports brand in the world, Adidas, coming in at $262 billion. This means that Nike is larger than even Toyota and Coca-Cola. While the magnitude of their success is super impressive, it's not too crazy when you consider that Nike shoes and clothing are basically ubiquitous. But despite the ubiquitous nature of Nike, most people have no clue who's behind the company. This is actually quite ironic given that Phil Knight's tenure at Nike is longer than the entire existence of Apple and Microsoft. On top of this, Phil is the 19th richest person in the world with a net worth of $62 billion. So here's the story of the mystery man behind Nike. Taking a look back, Phil Knight was born on February 24, 1938 in Portland, Oregon. Phil's father, Bill, was originally a lawyer by trade, but he had since opted to run his own newspaper publishing company called the Oregon Journal. Bill was quite a strict man who cared a lot about hard work and discipline. He didn't like the idea of handouts and thought that everyone needed to fend for themselves. This was made quite clear when he refused to give Phil a summer job at the Oregon Journal. Since Phil couldn't get a job at his father's company, he decided to apply for a job at Oregonian, who was his father's biggest rival. At Oregonian, Phil worked the morning shift where he tabulated sports scores. The job wasn't too bad, but the same could not be said about the commute. Phil had to run a full 7 miles each way to get to work and back. Fortunately though, Phil wasn't just a great runner, but he was a world-class runner. His personal best at the mile was just 4 minutes and 13 seconds. Moving into college, Phil would attend the University of Oregon in Eugene where he was a star athlete. In 1957, 58, and 59, Phil would win varsity letters for his track performance, and he would get the opportunity to be trained by the legendary Bill Bowerman. Throughout his career, Bill would train 31 Olympic athletes, 22 NCAA champions, and 16 sub-4-minute milers, so Bowerman knew what he was doing. Similar to Phil's father, Bowerman pushed Phil to always challenge the limits and never settle for average. Though it was easy for Phil to apply these principles to running, it wasn't so easy with academics. It's not that Phil was a bad student or anything, he was just confused as to what he wanted to do. He had been majoring in journalism, probably inspired by his father, but he was having second doubts about whether that's what he really wanted to do. So after graduation in 1959, Phil went ahead and joined the army. He completed a year of service before he decided that he wanted to return to school, enrolling in Stanford's MBA program. While completing his MBA, Phil would write a paper called "Can Japanese Sports Shoes Do to German Sports Shoes What Japanese Cameras Did to German Cameras?" And this would become the blueprint for Nike. Phil didn't just jump fully into selling shoes after college though. Instead, Phil opted to take the CPA exam and join a local accounting firm in Portland. In the background though, Phil was hard at work testing out different designs and securing contractors. In November of 1962, Phil traveled to Japan where he discovered something called the Tiger Brand shoe, manufactured by Onitsuka. Phil was thoroughly impressed by the high quality and low cost of the shoes, and would form a licensing deal with the company. After he returned to the US, Phil would reach out to his former coach, Bill Bowerman, to get his opinion on the shoe. And to Phil's surprise, Bill not only loved the shoes, but he was willing to join the business as a partner. Phil of course took Bill up on that offer, and the duo started Blue Ribbon Sports in January of 1964. Neither Phil nor Bill had any high-level business connections or enough money to market their product, so they decided to market their shoes the old-fashioned way. The duo started off by attending every track meet in the area and attempting to sell the shoes to the athletes. This was moderately successful, and they were able to sell 1,300 pairs by the end of the first year, grossing a total of $8,000 worth of sales. In their second year of business, the duo onboarded a full-time employee who helped them attend more track meets and over double sales to $20,000. And this gave them the confidence to open up a physical location in Santa Monica, California. By 1967, sales were doing so well that Phil would open another store on the East Coast in Wellesley, Massachusetts. About 2 years into running both stores, Phil would finally quit his accounting job and go all in on the business. This seemed like a great decision for 2 years, but in 1971, the company would run into a massive roadblock. They had a dispute with their manufacturer, Onitsuka, and the two would choose to go separate ways. Given that Blue Ribbon Sports no longer had the rights to sell Onitsuka shoes, Phil and Bill were forced to create their own shoes, and that brings us to Nike. Given Phil's experience as an athlete himself, he decided to design the shoes based on what he would want as a runner. He also consulted with other runners such as long-distance runner Steve Prefontaine to get feedback on the shoes and improve the design. Most news sources report that it was Phil who designed the company's first shoes, but an Olympic athlete named Otis Davis suggests that it was actually Bill. Otis was one of the first people to try the new shoes, and he says that he physically witnessed Bill make the new shoes with a waffle iron. In terms of his experience with the shoes, Otis says that he didn't particularly like how they felt on his feet, as the shoes had no support and they were too tight. So clearly, Bill and Phil had some work to do, but they would figure it out over the next few years. In terms of branding for the shoe, the duo didn't want to use the Blue Ribbon Sports brand as it wasn't that catchy or memorable. When they were brainstorming new brand ideas, an employee named Jeff Johnson would suggest the name Nike, which is the name of the Greek winged goddess of victory. Around the same time, Phil reached out to a graphic design student named Carolyn Davidson, and he paid her $35 to create a new logo for the new brand. Carolyn came up with a couple of logo designs, but Phil wasn't a fan of any of them. Carolyn offered to modify the designs and come up with new designs as well, but Phil didn't want to delay the manufacturing process any further. So he simply settled with the swoosh logo, stating that maybe it'll grow on him. Ironically, the swoosh logo has turned into one of the most iconic and recognizable logos in the world. Anyway, Nike's first track shoe, the Cortez, made its debut at the 1972 Olympic trials, and it didn't take long for the shoe to spread like wildfire. Runners around the world wanted to try out this new shoe put out by Bill Bowerman, and once they tried it, they were hooked. Within just 8 years, Nike went from launching their first shoe to controlling 50% of the athletic shoe market. Nike became such a large portion of Blue Ribbon Sports that Phil decided to rename the company itself Nike in 1978. And in 1980, Bill would take the company public. Bill slowly cashed out throughout the 1980s and started to step away from the business as he was getting quite old. But Phil was just getting started, and his next order of business was securing endorsements. One of Nike's first endorsement deals was with the tennis superstar John McEnroe. John had recently hurt his ankle and was taking some time off. But when he finally returned, he was wearing Nike shoes, which exploded the popularity of Nike amongst the tennis world. Up until then, Nike shoes were mainly purchased by runners. But after this positive experience with John, Phil realized that he could use other sports stars to break into those sports as well. This of course leads us to the partnerships with Michael Jordan, Andre Agassi, Charles Barkley, and Tiger Woods. In the 1990s, Nike expanded into hockey, golf, and soccer, and by the end of the decade, they would achieve over $10 billion in annual sales. Unfortunately, Bill passed away at the end of 1999, right before the turn of the century. But there's no doubt that he lived a solid life stretching 88 years. Anyway, Nike was also making several acquisitions to aid in their growth. For example, in 1988, they bought Cole Haan, which they would eventually sell in 2012. Similarly, they bought Bowerman in 1994 and sold it in 2008. But by far their most famous acquisition didn't come till 2003 when they purchased Converse. Moving into the new century, Nike has placed a strong emphasis on sports technology. They started selling heart rate monitors, high-altitude wrist compasses, and they partnered with companies like Apple. All of this has secured Nike's position as the dominant sports player in the new tech-filled world. But the same cannot be said about Phil Knight. There's no question that Phil is quite a private man who avoids the spotlight as much as possible. I'm sure his value for privacy plays a large role in this, but I think there are also some other factors driving him away from the public's view, starting with nepotism. Unlike Phil's father, who refused to give Phil a job at his own company, Phil goes out of his way to help his children through their careers. Take his son Travis, for example. After an unsuccessful attempt at becoming a rapper, Travis decided to become an animator. In 1998, Phil would buy 15% of an animation studio named Dimension Studios, and Travis would get a job there shortly after as an animator. A few years later, Phil would buy the entire studio, rename it Laika, and appoint Travis to the new board. On top of this, Phil would invest $180 million into the company to help them produce their first stop-motion film called Coraline. And after the launch of the film, Travis would become the new CEO and president of the company. I don't know about you, but it looks to me like Phil used his influence and money to transition Travis from being a failed rapper to being the CEO of an animation studio. Now of course, Phil didn't break any laws or do anything illegal, but this isn't particularly a good look. Aside from nepotism, Phil doesn't have the best of records when it comes to human rights. Since the 1990s, Nike has been pummeled with human rights concerns and poor treatment of employees. There are reports suggesting that Nike workers in Vietnam were earning just 61 to 89 cents per hour in 2016, and the use of corporal punishment is allegedly common in their factories. Here in the US, many activists are complaining that Amazon doesn't pay enough. And let's not forget, Amazon has a minimum wage of $15 per hour for all US employees. Yet, Jeff Bezos is one of the most hated billionaires out there. Compared to Jeff Bezos, Phil Knight's popularity doesn't even make it onto the charts. Imagine if Phil was as popular as Jeff. He'd be torched alive by the media for paying employees less than $1 per hour. And I think we'd agree that it's better to not be known at all than to have a negative public perception like Jeff Bezos. Aside from paying low wages and nepotism, Phil is also notorious for extreme lobbying efforts. Over the years, Phil has spent millions of dollars on political donations to Republican candidates in Oregon. Similarly, he was the single largest donor for the campaign against Oregon ballot measures 66 and 67. This legislation was supposed to increase income tax on corporations and high-income individuals. Now, I'm not saying that Phil should pay more taxes or that he's wrong for supporting the Republican Party. The fundamental problem isn't the policies that he's supporting. The fundamental problem is that he's using his money to influence the government. And I think both sides can agree that this is wrong. Considering all this, maybe Phil's relatively small public image isn't due to his modesty or privacy, but because he doesn't want to attract attention towards his frowned-upon activities. But that's just speculation. Why do you guys think Phil is so private? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you're a fan of Nike's products but wish that their business was a lot cleaner. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.